There was menace in the footsteps all around him. Every pair of boots that clicked and clacked their way down the cobblestone street was a potential threat. Edmund looked around carefully, trying to judge if anyone was following behind him. Crossing the street to an area with more street lamps, he was startled to find himself almost run down by a horse-drawn carriage. Breathing deeply, he tried to calm his pounding heart. Edmund turned the collar of his coat up and tilted his high hat forward to obscure his face. As long as they didn't see where I was, he thought. As long as they didn't see. He considered returning home, but the danger was still too great. So he turned and walked down another dimly lit side street, away from the clatter of horse hooves and wheels. But there it was again, the clicking of boots. Edmund whipped around and stared down the alleyway, willing someone to approach, but no one did. There was cold steel at the back of his neck, and hot breath in his ear. Edmund froze. "Where is it, Clockmaker?" a voice whispered. He couldn't speak. Suddenly, the footsteps were all around him as men in long black coats emerged from the shadows. "Where is it?" the voice said more menacingly, shoving the barrel of the gun hard into his spine. "Where is what?" Edmund croaked. "Don't play games, old man," the voice growled. A hand had now grabbed a hold of the back of Edmund's coat and was twisting it. Edmund instinctively put his hands up to the level of his face to show the approaching men that he was unarmed. "Where is the copy?" "There never was a copy," Edmund said, beginning to tremble. "That was a lie started by—" "Just shoot him!" one of the men in the front of Edmund snarled, drawing his own gun. "We don't need him. He's obviously got it on him. Just shoot him and take it." "You don't know him like I do. He wouldn't just have it on him. He likes his little puzzles," said the voice behind Edmund. "I swear to you, I don't have what you're looking for," Edmund said. "I've never been allowed near enough to the original to—" Another man drew a gun from inside his coat. The group of 4 or 5 men had all closed around Edmund in a tight circle. The man behind him twisted his coat once more. "Don't lie to us," the voice hissed. "You know who sent us, don't you? He's seen the copy, and he knows you have it. Now just tell us where it is, and I'll let you go." Edmund tried to clear his mind, to think of some way out. "My hat," he said. "Let me remove my hat." He heard the sound of several handguns cocking. "No tricks," the voice said. Edmund reached up slowly, removed his top hat, and offered it to the man behind him. "In the lining," he said. The man released his grip of Edmund's coat and took the hat. Edmund heard his shoes scuff a little on the cobblestones and felt the angle of the gun barrel shift ever so slightly on his neck. He took the chance and slipped through the small gap in the circle the man had created and ran. A few shots rang out immediately, but Edmund willed himself to run to the main street. A bullet caught him in the ankle, and he felt it slice the tendon. He fell hard on the stones. "Don't shoot him!" someone yelled. Edmund tried to crawl, but it was no use. The footsteps were behind him, angry, running footsteps. Another shot fired, and Edmund felt it enter his back. "No! Stop shooting, you idiots!" the voice screamed. Quite suddenly, Edmund found he had no breath. One of the men had reached him and was turning him over. Edmund stared into the man's panicked eyes. He knew these eyes. He knew the face, too. He tried to speak, but instead of sound, blood bubbled up from his throat. The man held up Edmund's head, almost cradling him in his lap. "Oh, God," the man whispered. More blood poured from Edmund's lips and began to collect in a sticky puddle on the cobblestones below him. "Protect," he managed to choke out. "Protect Clara." The man nodded as the rest of his gang caught up to them. "He's already dead," one of them said quietly. "We should go." The man holding Edmund's head slowly released him and stood up. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Edmund's eyes fixed on him, and his body began to shake and shiver on the ground, finally coming to a violently unnerving stop. I'm sorry, the man said again. Then after a moment, he turned to the others and commanded them, Go quickly! The group of men soon faded back into the shadows of the alleyway without a sound. Henry stood outside the shop, staring up at the sign, Dent and Company, Timepieces and Mechanical Wonders, established 1843. He smiled to himself. I knew it, he said quietly. The mid-afternoon fog had turned most of London into a cold and dismal tangle of streets, but inside this shop there shone a brilliant light that spilled out into the doorstep and made the frosted glass windows sparkle. Henry caught one or two glimpses of movement from beyond the walls within, but couldn't quite make out any figures that looked to be human. Slowly, he stepped up and opened the door. A bell rang somewhere. There was a rustling of the curtain behind the shop counter, and a tall man appeared. Henry took a small step back. This was not a face he knew, and certainly not one he had expected to see. The tall man smiled at Henry in a disturbingly polite manner. Welcome, sir. Can I help you? He said in a soft but authoritative voice. Henry snatched the bowler hat from off his head and held it close to his chest with one hand while smoothing down his flyaway straw-colored hair. He glanced around him quickly, noting the movement he had witnessed from outside was a result of the myriad of clocks adorning the walls of the small showroom. Near the counter was a shelf containing intricate-looking tin toys. I've heard a lot about the fine work being done here, and I wish to see it for myself, Henry said to the tall man. Are you looking for anything in particular, sir? No, not really, Henry said lazily, approaching the nearest clock, a simple round-faced piece covered by a glass dome and seated delicately on a shelf. There was something rather odd about the movement of the hands, something slightly off-putting, but Henry couldn't quite put his finger on it. Well, please do let me know if you see anything you like, the tall man said. I'll just be in the back if you need to call for me. My name is Nixon. And he turned to go back behind the curtain. Nixon? Henry asked as casually as he could manage. Yes, sir. Levi Nixon, at your service, the man said, turning back around. I was hoping to speak with the owner of this shop, actually, Mr. Nixon, Henry said, moving over to a large grandfather clock with an ornate filigree design. This clock, too, had the same off-putting movement to it. I am the owner, sir, Levi Nixon said. You are? Henry asked, looking at him again. Yes, sir. Then, can I speak to the person who makes the clocks? I am also that person. Henry sized Levi up. Now he knew he was being lied to. You made these clocks? Yes, sir. The sign out front says Dent and Company. Yes, sir. I bought the establishment from a man who used to own it, Mr. Edmund Dent. The name already holds a connotation of quality goods, as you may well know, so I decided to keep it as is. Levi smiled patiently. Henry supposed Levi to be about the same age as he was, mid-30s at the very least. Though he had a genteel appearance, Henry could tell that there was quite a bit of bulk beneath his obsessively clean clothes. In fact, there wasn't a spot on the man, not even a hair out of place in his delicately swept-back, russet-colored locks. His face was heavy and chiseled, with a square jaw and high cheekbones. For some reason, Henry was also bothered by the enormity of Levi's hands. And the toys there, Henry said, gesturing to the shelf beside the counter. Yes, sir. Do you like them? They are my specialty, said Levi, picking up a little tin soldier and winding the key on its back. He placed the tiny figure onto the counter, where it began to march back and forth, its miniature rifle against its shoulder. But this was no ordinary tin toy, at least not like any tin toy Henry had ever seen. This one did not have the staccato motions of a clockwork mechanism. It had the almost fluid movement of a real man. Henry watched in amazement as the little articulated limbs flexed this way and that, the knees bending perfectly, and the free arms swinging in precise, yet flowing rhythm with the legs. Suddenly, Henry realized what had unnerved him about the movement of the clocks. They had this same unnatural fluidity, especially apparent in the second hands that rather than clicking from one position to the next, were actually making a smooth circle around the numbered faces. "You didn't make any of this," Henry said, narrowing his eyes at Levi. "I assure you, sir, that I did." "You, sir, did not," Henry retorted, folding his arms. "Now I'd like to speak to her, if you don't mind." Levi dropped his polite smile, and his face suddenly seemed much colder and calculating. "Just a moment, sir," he said, and ducked back behind the curtain. Clara stared at the tiny gears of the pocket watch for a moment, visualizing exactly where she was going to place the next piece. The light in the basement-level workshop was dimming, so she turned up the gas lamp on her work table. With a pair of tarnished tweezers, she picked up a small, smooth silver cog from the table and delicately placed it in the watch back, then looped the minuscule rubber circle over it, linking it to another cog on the other side of the clockworks. She turned the fob on the side of the watch and gazed with satisfaction as the two cogs turned in unison with the rest of the gears. "There's a gentleman here to see you, my lady," Levi said, approaching from the upstairs opening to the shop. "Me? What do you mean he's here to see me?" Clara asked, turning up the magnifying lens she had been wearing. "He asked to see the person who made the clocks," Levi said simply, folding his hands in front of him. "Didn't you tell him that you make the clocks?" Clara sighed. "I did, my lady. The gentleman did not seem to believe me." Clara blinked at Levi. "What?" she said. "The gentleman seemed to know there was a woman behind the making of the items in the shop and asked to speak with you. I thought it best to drop the pretense." Clara shook her head, removing the magnifying lens from the top of her head and reaching for the eye patch and black leather gloves sitting on the work table. "Stay behind the curtain," she said to Levi as she passed him and entered the shop. Now that he understood what had been so unsettling about the movement of the hands on the clock faces, Henry smiled to himself. "She always complained about the clicking," he thought. "Couldn't stand the movement of the hands. Finally has them working the way she wanted." He reached out to the grandfather clock and made to open the thin glass door on the clock face. "I suggest you leave it alone. The clock costs more than you're worth," said a woman's voice. Henry looked around at the curtain. A sinewy figure had emerged, only once again, this was not the person he had expected to see. And yet, it was. Clara had changed drastically since he had last seen her. Her frame had filled out a bit, but her once rounded face was almost gaunt. She wore what appeared to be men's clothing: heeled boots, pinstripe trousers, a white shirt stained with multicolored splotches of grease, black gloves, and a striped waistcoat. Her long wavy hair, which she wore loose over her shoulders, had once been a soft auburn, but now seemed to be a dark shade of violet. Most noticeably, she wore a pewter-colored patch over her right eye. "Hello, Henry," she said softly. Henry nodded at her, too stunned to speak. Clara eyed him impatiently. "Levi said you wished to speak with me," she said. "I had to see if it was you. It's been a long time, Clara." "It has? What are you doing here, Henry?" Henry felt a little taken back by her coldness, but he took a few steps toward her. I heard there was a clockmaker working from your father's old shop, so I came round, saw the clocks, and I knew it had to be you that made them. You developed the pulley system, I assume." Clara nodded once more. "You were right," Henry said, glancing at the little tin soldier on the counter, who had put himself into a seated position when his key had unwound. "It's a much smoother movement." Clara stared at him, drumming her fingertips on the counter as though expecting him to place an order. You've changed," Henry ventured. Clara took a deep breath. "A bit, I suppose. It's been almost 10 years since you left. Change tends to happen." "It's not what I meant. Your hair, it's purple, yes, I know. It's from the anthocyan. Sorry? The anthocyan. It's a chemical I use in the lubricant for the clockworks. My own special concoction. Of course. Anthocyan has a sort of purple color to it. I work with the lubricant so often that it seems to have seeped in, she explained, removing one of her gloves to reveal her fingers, which had been stained the same violet color. Can't seem to get rid of it. And your eye? Clara removed the patch. Her right eye was spotted white and blue, standing in stark contrast to her left eye, which was still the same shade of mossy hazel that Henry remembered. Chemical spill. Bleached out the iris, Clara said. Still works perfectly fine, but it's a bit unsightly, so I wear this. She held out the eye patch to Henry, and he could now see that it was made of a very fine mesh metal. You really shouldn't be so careless, Henry smirked. She didn't smile. You never were one for little details like safety. Your father would be ashamed. He looked into her eyes and registered the look of sadness that had overwhelmed them, though she kept the rest of her face stoic. I was so sorry to hear about his death. Clara's face seemed to soften a bit, and she looked away from Henry, and down to the little tin soldier. Did they ever find out who did it? Henry asked carefully. No, Clara replied softly. The inspectors told me they knew what group had done it, but they had no idea how to catch them. Was it rebels? Yes. I was told that it was a for-all group because of the handguns they used, which that specific group imports from America. They knew because of the bullets. Instead of being rounded, they were pointed on one end for better penetration. Clara paused, clenching her fists on the countertop. Henry reached out and put his hand over one of hers. I'm sorry, Clara. He didn't deserve that. Clara looked back up at him, and for a moment, he suddenly saw the serious girl who used to putter around her father's workshop, asking annoying questions about the various functions of the gears. 5 years on, and it's still odd to think about, she said quietly, withdrawing her hand from under Henry's. After a moment or so, she seemed to have regained her cold sense of indifference. What happened to you, then? She asked. This and that, you know. Went on a boat for a bit, found work where I could, Henry said with a dismissive gesture of his hand. Not much out there for a disgraced apprentice. And now? Working for a wealthy man, just doing odd jobs here and there. That's how I heard about the clock shop being open again. One of the man's friends was talking about a little toy horse he'd bought for his son. Said it moved like the real thing, a marvel of design and all that. I asked him about where it came from. When he told me about the clock shop on Fleet Street, I just knew. I knew you'd reopen the shop, and I had to see for myself. Clara nodded thoughtfully. Behind her, the curtain rustled. Who's the bloke, then? Henry asked, jerking his head towards the curtain. Your husband? Nixon? No, he's my valet. Henry raised his eyebrows. Valet? Why do you have a valet? He assists me with the shop. He handles the orders and the supplies and the stocking, that sort of thing. And why is he telling people he owns the place? Because I told him to. Why? I don't like dealing with the public. Too many questions. Questions about my father, the crystal rose, the potion, all of it. I got sick of it. So I asked Nixon to pose as the owner and the operator.